In 1923 Germany, money wasn't counted. It was carried. Every morning, workers streamed out of factories with their wages, not with relief, but with panic. They didn't linger. They didn't rest. They sprinted through the streets, racing to shops before their pay turned worthless by nightfall. Housewives, once careful with their household budgets, now pushed wheelbarrows filled with freshly printed notes to the bakery. At the counter, they poured stacks of marks across the table for a single loaf of bread. By the time they walked home, prices had already risen again. Children played with the money, but not in the way their parents had hoped. They folded bills into paper kites, built towers out of bundles, and even used them as wallpaper. Cash had become so cheap that toys cost more than the currency itself. The collapse wasn't gradual. It was shocking. In just 1 year, a stable middle-class society was reduced to chaos. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January skyrocketed to 200 billion marks by November. Families who had saved for decades saw their life's work dissolve in weeks. And this was not some distant poor nation. This was Germany, the heart of Europe, home to industry, science, and culture. Yet, it was brought to its knees by a single truth. When money dies, everything else begins to unravel. The nightmare didn't begin with printing presses, it began with war. World War I left Germany defeated, humiliated, and drowning in debt. The Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations so crushing that even seasoned bankers were stunned. 132 billion gold marks, more than 3 times the size of Germany's entire economy. To put that into today's terms, imagine demanding that a modern nation hand over trillions of dollars every year in gold, coal, and foreign currency it didn't have. Germany's gold reserves were nearly empty. Its coal mines were crippled by strikes. Factories ran half empty under shortages and sabotage. The math was simple. Germany owed more than it could ever pay. Inside the country, resentment festered. Citizens called the treaty a chain of shame. Politicians were trapped. If they raised taxes, they risked riots in the streets. If they refused payment, they risked foreign occupation. So they turned to the only tool they still controlled: the printing press. At first, it looked clever. Paper money could cover reparations, wages, and deficits without directly taxing the people. To many, it felt painless, a shortcut around the impossible. But economists sounded the alarm. Printing more money without more production is like pouring water into wine. You dilute its strength. The warnings went unheeded. The Reichsbank kept printing, and once that habit took hold, it became almost impossible to stop. By 1921, the German mark was already sick, but not yet dying. $1 bought about 60 marks. Painful, still survivable. Then came the Ruhr. When Germany fell behind on reparations, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, the nation's industrial heart. Mines, mills, and rail lines were seized. Berlin answered with passive resistance. Workers struck. Trains stopped. Output collapsed. And yet wages still had to be paid. Where did the money come from? From the press. The government financed strikes and deficits by issuing ever more paper marks. Each new note diluted the value of the last. Prices that rose monthly began to rise weekly, then daily. Exchange rates tell the story in brutal clarity. In early 1923, $1 cost 7,000 marks. By midsummer, it cost 160,000. In November, the rate blew past 4.2 trillion marks for a single US dollar. Shops rewrote prices between breakfast and lunch. Landlords demanded rent in goods or dollars. Insurance policies, savings accounts, and pensions disintegrated in real time. The culture shifted with the numbers. Businesses printed price lists in pencil. Cafes charged more at night than in the morning. Workers insisted on pay twice a day and ran straight to market because waiting meant hunger. The spiral fed itself. As the mark fell, foreigners dumped it, pushing it lower still. Germans rushed to spend before prices rose again, which made prices rise again. Confidence cracked, and once confidence cracks, money is no longer a measure. It is a rumor. Within 2 years, the mark was not merely weak. It was untrusted, unwanted, and finally, unusable. Hyperinflation wasn't a theory to be debated in classrooms. It was chaos lived out in kitchens, factories, and shops. In Berlin, workers poured out of factory gates clutching envelopes so stuffed with bills that the seams ripped open. Their wives were waiting at the gates, sprinting toward markets before prices doubled by lunchtime. Bread bought in the morning could cost twice as much by evening. Employers sometimes paid wages twice a day just to give families a chance to eat before their pay dissolved into dust. The price of bread tells the story best. In January 1923, a loaf cost 250 marks. By midsummer, it was 3,000 marks. By November, the same loaf cost 200 billion marks. People didn't just lose wealth, They lost the meaning of numbers themselves. Children used stacks of banknotes as building blocks. Some folded them into paper kites. Housewives burned bundles of notes in stoves because money was cheaper than coal. Families wallpapered rooms with bills rather than buy paint. Shops stopped printing menus or price tags because ink was too expensive and prices changed faster than they could be written. Farmers refused to trade grain for paper that would rot in value before they reached home. Instead, markets shifted to barter: potatoes for shoes, firewood for cloth, wedding rings for meat. A shopkeeper wrote in his diary, "Customers no longer ask the price. They only ask if I will take their money." Savings that took decades to build vanished in weeks. Teachers, clerks, and shopkeepers, the backbone of Germany's middle class, were reduced to pawning heirlooms for food or lining up at soup kitchens. The collapse of money was the collapse of trust. Trust in wages, trust in contracts, trust in the government itself. Hyperinflation did not fall equally on all shoulders. It divided Germany into two nations, one drowning in misery, the other seizing opportunity. For debtors, it was liberation. A businessman in Cologne borrowed millions of marks to expand his factory in early 1923. By the time his loan came due months later, the repayment was so worthless that he cleared it with the cost of a tram ticket. Debts melted in the fire of inflation. Borrowers who had once been cornered by obligations walked free. Foreign investors descended like vultures. With US dollars or British pounds, currencies still trusted, they bought German factories, hotels, and even entire newspapers for pennies on the mark. To them, Berlin was a clearance sale. Generations of German savings passed into foreign hands in a single season. But for savers, the collapse was ruin. Pensioners who had carefully set aside marks across decades found they couldn't buy bread. Insurance payouts were worthless. Dowries and retirement funds shrank to scraps of paper. The middle class, the clerks, teachers, and shopkeepers, was gutted. They had lived by thrift and discipline. Inflation mocked those virtues, wiping them out overnight. The countryside fared differently. Farmers could at least barter: wheat for cloth, potatoes for tools. City dwellers had no such buffer. A school teacher's salary might buy a tram ride, but not a meal. Families who had once lived with pride lined up at soup kitchens, ashamed yet hungry. The psychological wound ran deepest. Parents sent children to school with satchels full of notes, only to find lunch had doubled in price before noon. Trust cracked between workers and employers, banks and depositors, citizens and their government. Resentment fermented. The poor accused the rich of profiteering. The middle class accused the state of betrayal. That bitterness did not vanish when inflation ended. It lingered, waiting for a voice. As chaos mounted, the government lurched from patch to patch, each one weaker than the last. The Reichsbank's printing presses thundered day and night in Berlin, Munich, Leipzig. Trains carried banknotes across the country, but by the time they arrived, the paper was already worth less than the cost of shipping. Printers ran out of quality stock. Some bills were printed only on one side to save ink. Publishers canceled books and newspapers because paper was diverted to feed the insatiable appetite for money. Denominations exploded. First thousands, then millions, then billions. By the end, trillions. Notes that once fit in wallets now filled wheelbarrows. Some were so absurd that children stacked them into forts. Families used bundles of bills as kindling. Money had become fuel, wallpaper, and toys, everything except a store of value. Employers tried to keep workers alive by paying wages twice a day. Morning pay could buy lunch. Afternoon pay might stretch to bread. By dawn the next day, yesterday's wages were worthless. The state experimented with price and wage controls, but they backfired. Bakers couldn't sell bread for less than the cost of flour, so bread vanished from shelves. Farmers refused to deliver produce into cities where official prices meant guaranteed loss. A black market took over, where bread cost 10 times the legal rate, and only those with foreign currency or barter goods could buy. Finally, in desperation, the government introduced the Rentenmark in late 1923. It wasn't backed by gold, that was gone, but by mortgages on German land and industry. The logic was simple. Land can't vanish, factories can't evaporate, so tie money to them. The Rentenmark restored some stability, but too late for ordinary Germans who had already lost everything. By the time trust flickered back, it was not money that had changed, but people. They no longer believed in savings, pensions, or the state's promises. They remembered who had suffered most and who had survived just fine. By late 1923, Germany was not just broke, it was broken. Pensioners who had trusted the state discovered their monthly payout couldn't buy bread. Middle-class families who thought themselves safe, teachers, shopkeepers, clerks, were humiliated, selling heirlooms for food. Meanwhile, those with assets, Land, gold, foreign currency survived, even thrived. To ordinary Germans, it looked rigged. The rich lived, the poor starved, the state stood idle. Resentment poisoned politics. Some blamed the Allies, others blamed bankers. Conspiracy theories flourished, scapegoating minorities and outsiders. Trust in the Weimar Republic collapsed alongside the currency. Democracy looked weak, useless in crisis. Parties shouted promises. Citizens grew cynical. Many decided only strong men could restore order. This was Weimar's legacy. Not just empty shelves, but empty faith. Once money dies, trust in institutions soon follows. And when institutions fail, radical voices rise. By the time stability returned, confidence was gone. The scars remained, and history shows who stepped into the vacuum. Weimar's hyperinflation feels extreme, almost like a nightmare no modern society could ever repeat. But history has a way of whispering before it shouts, and if you listen closely, the echoes are already here. Today, governments don't send workers home with wheelbarrows of paper marks. Instead, they flood the world with digital money, trillions created at the push of a button. During the pandemic, the United States alone unleashed over $5 trillion in stimulus, while central banks expanded their balance sheets by more than $9 trillion combined. Across Europe, Asia, and beyond, the story was the same. Money created faster than goods could be produced. At first, it felt like relief. Just as Weimar's printing presses kept workers afloat, modern stimulus kept businesses open, paychecks arriving, and markets from collapse. But beneath the relief, the cracks began to show. By 2022, U.S. inflation hit 9.1%, the highest in 40 years. Grocery bills surged, rents climbed, and gas doubled in some regions. Families noticed that wages weren't keeping pace. In Europe, the energy shock from the war in Ukraine made heating homes painfully expensive. In the United Kingdom, inflation peaked above 11%, eroding savings faster than at any time in living memory. And look further afield. In Argentina, prices rose so fast in 2023 that inflation topped 120% a year. Families rushed to supermarkets on payday, knowing their pesos would buy less tomorrow. In Turkey, the lira lost so much value that shopkeepers scribbled prices on chalkboards, updating them every few hours, eerily similar to cafes in Weimar Germany. In Lebanon, citizens woke to find their life savings frozen, their banks imposing withdrawal limits because the money inside was no longer trusted. Even in wealthy nations, people felt the psychological shift. Once money feels unstable, behavior changes. Housing markets inflated to record highs as cheap debt fueled bidding wars. Stocks soared not only on earnings, but on a flood of liquidity. Cryptocurrencies became a modern refuge, digital gold for people who feared their government's paper promises. When Germans hoarded gold coins in 1923, they weren't so different from today's investors piling into Bitcoin during inflation spikes. And here is the most unsettling echo. Inflation isn't only about numbers, it's about trust. Once people believe money will buy less tomorrow, they stop saving. They spend faster, they speculate wildly. That psychology transforms economies long before hyperinflation arrives. Weimar shows us the endgame. But the beginning always looks the same. Governments promising that printing and borrowing are painless, citizens adapting in small ways, and the fabric of trust beginning to fray. It doesn't take wheelbarrows of cash to shake confidence. All it takes is a creeping suspicion that the money in your hand or the digits in your bank account may not mean tomorrow what it means today. And that suspicion, once seated, is almost impossible to uproot. Weimar's collapse was never just about economics. It was about something far more fragile. Trust. Trust in wages, trust in savings, trust in government. Trust in the simple promise that effort today would mean security tomorrow. When that trust cracked, the currency died first, and the republic soon followed. And that is why Weimar matters today, because our world also runs on trust. Trillions in national debt, families burdened with mortgages and loans that stretch decades into the future. Markets kept alive by central banks promising that tomorrow's money will cover today's risks. On the surface, the system still works, but beneath the surface, the questions grow louder. What happens if the dollar, the euro, or the yen loses the confidence that holds it up? What happens when people start believing, not in theory, but in their everyday lives, that money will always buy less tomorrow than it does today? And when that moment comes, who will pay the price? Will it be the bankers and politicians who built the system? Or the ordinary families whose paychecks, pensions, and savings quietly erode? Weimar's story warns us that collapse rarely announces itself. It creeps in quietly through rising grocery bills, shrinking savings, rent that swallows income, and a slow erosion of faith in money itself. By the time people reach for wheelbarrows, the damage has already been done. So here is the challenge for us. Can we defend honesty in money before trust disappears? Can we demand systems that measure value truthfully instead of disguising debt with printing and promises? Or will we look back, like the Germans of 1923, and realize too late that the signs were already there? History never repeats exactly, but it rhymes loudly enough for those willing to listen. The rhyme of Weimar is not subtle. It's a mirror. The question is whether we choose to see ourselves in it. Weimar's collapse proved how fast money can vanish when trust disappears. But there's another story, slower, more insidious, that shaped the world for centuries. Rome's currency, once the backbone of empire, was debased until it became little more than bronze dust. And when money died, the empire followed.